August 1st, 1943, Blackett Strait, Solomon Islands. A suffocating black velvet night, thick and humid, pressed down on the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer Amagiri. On its bridge, Commander Kohei Hanami stood, a figure of serene, untouchable power, a modern samurai commanding this sleek, deadly instrument of the Emperor's will. The deck thrummed with the Amagiri's turbines, a low hum resonating with the scent of diesel and sea. His mission, a routine, high-speed supply run down the slot, delivering men and materiel to beleaguered garrisons. A dangerous but familiar task. Hanami expected an American destroyer, a worthy adversary for a nighttime duel, a battle of equals for which he was prepared. What he did not expect was a new sound. A faint, distant buzzing quickly resolved into something alien. A ragged, unsynchronized, high-performance roar. Not a single aircraft or synchronized warship engines, but multiple powerful engines, slightly out of tune, like a pack of angry mechanical beasts. It was the sound of 3 Packard 4M 2500 V12 marine engines, 4,500 American horsepower, the sound of chaos being born from the shadows for Commander Hanami. To understand the terror this sound would come to represent, one must step back into the brutal strategic reality of the South Pacific in 1942 and 1943. The struggle for the Solomon Islands, centered on the bloody campaign for Guadalcanal, had become a war of attrition that Japan could not win. By day, the skies belonged to the Americans. From a muddy airstrip on Guadalcanal known as Henderson Field, the aircraft of the Cactus Air Force rose to meet any Japanese ship that dared to enter the waters of the slot. The result was a graveyard of sunken ships that would come to be known as Iron Bottom Sound. But when the sun set, the equation changed. The American planes returned to base, and the night belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Almost every evening, fast destroyers and cruisers, dubbed the Tokyo Express by the Americans, would race down the narrow straits, delivering just enough food, ammunition, and reinforcements to keep the starving Japanese army on Guadalcanal from collapsing entirely. For the Japanese destroyer captains who commanded these missions, it was a point of immense pride. They were the lifeline of the army, operating with skill and daring in the face of a powerful enemy. Their ships were magnificent weapons. A Fubuki-class destroyer like the Amagiri was a formidable opponent, armed with powerful 5-inch guns, and most importantly, the Type 93 torpedo. Nicknamed the Long Lance by the Allies, the Type 93 was the finest naval torpedo of the Second World War. It was oxygen-propelled, leaving almost no wake, and carried a massive warhead nearly twice as far and faster than its American counterpart. The Japanese had perfected the art of night fighting, training their lookouts to have almost superhuman night vision and their torpedo crews to be brutally efficient. A Japanese destroyer captain expected to fight a battle of maneuver and precision, a deadly ballet in the dark against an enemy he could respect. He expected to face cruisers and destroyers. He had no category, no frame of reference for what was about to confront him. Their entire doctrine was built around these elegant, long-range duels between steel warships. The American answer to the Tokyo Express was not another fleet of destroyers, but something far more unconventional, a weapon that perfectly embodied the American spirit of improvisation and industrial might. The Patrol Torpedo boat, the PT boat. Its heart, the recurring symbol of its power, was its engine, the Packard 4 M2500. This was not a purpose-built marine engine. It was a derivative of the legendary Liberty L-12 aircraft engine from World War I, massively upgraded and marinized. It was a supercharged V12 gasoline engine, a marvel of high-performance engineering born from America's love affair with the internal combustion engine. The sound of 3 of these engines roaring to life was the sound of Detroit's automotive prowess going to war. It was loud, thirsty, and fantastically powerful. Packard, a luxury car manufacturer, turned its factories over to building thousands of these engines with a speed incomprehensible to the Japanese. The sound of those engines was the sound of a nation that could turn its car factories into weapons factories overnight. It was the sound of abundance. The boats these engines powered were as unconventional as the engines themselves. An Elco 80-foot PT boat was not a warship in the traditional sense. It was a planing speedboat, built not of steel, but of 2 layers of mahogany planking over a frame of spruce and oak. It was, in essence, a giant wooden motorboat packed with high-octane aviation gasoline and armed with torpedoes, machine guns, and later, cannons and rockets. The crews were another expression of the American way of war. They were not career naval officers steeped in tradition. They were 90-day wonders, young reserve officers, stockbrokers, lawyers, and college students, given a crash course in tactics and then turned loose in the dark, hostile waters of the Pacific. They were individualists, improvisers, and brawlers. They called their own boats expendable. The Japanese had built a fleet of exquisite, dueling rapiers. The Americans had responded by mass-producing a fleet of wooden clubs and handing them to street fighters. For a Japanese officer like Commander Hanami, steeped in a culture that revered the permanence of steel, the idea of a warship made of plywood was laughable. His initial expectation was that they were insignificant pests, gnats to be swatted away. His destroyer weighed over 2,000 tons. A PT boat displaced less than 50. What threat could a small wooden boat pose? This sense of arrogant dismissal was common throughout the Imperial Navy. They were about to experience a form of warfare that did not play by the rules, a chaotic, close-range brawl that negated all their advantages of range and firepower. The first encounters were confusing. A PT boat squadron, hiding in a dark cove, would get a radar contact. Then the night would erupt. The sound of the Packard engines would roar out of the darkness as a dozen boats charged in from multiple directions at over 40 knots. For the lookouts on the Japanese destroyer, it was a nightmare. Instead of one large, predictable target, they were faced with a swarm of small, fast, highly maneuverable targets. The Japanese main guns, designed for slow, deliberate fire, could not traverse fast enough to track the darting PT boats. Shells would splash harmlessly. The destroyers would be forced to break formation, their supply run thrown into chaos as they swerved to avoid torpedoes. Often, the PT boats failed to score a hit, but the mission was still a success. They had forced the Tokyo Express to jettison its precious cargo and turn back, denying soldiers on shore their lifeline. The Japanese commanders returned to base fuming, having burned precious fuel and accomplished nothing, all because of a few insignificant wooden boats. But soon frustration curdled into genuine fear. The gnats had a deadly sting. In the Battle of Blackett Strait on March 5, 1943, PT boats located 2 Japanese destroyers, the Murasame and Minagumo. Their torpedo attack, while not scoring direct hits, forced the destroyers into confusion, silhouetting them just as American cruisers arrived. In the ensuing gun battle, both Japanese destroyers were sunk. The PT boats had acted as the perfect bait. The transformation in the Japanese perception of the PT boat was beginning. They were no longer just a nuisance. They were a genuine, lethal threat. The fear was not of being sunk in a glorious duel, but of being swarmed in the dark, of being pecked to death by 1,000 small cuts. A captured Japanese document revealed the growing anxiety. It described the PT boats as devil boats and warned destroyer crews of their tactics. They appear suddenly out of the darkness from all directions, creating a great disturbance and firing torpedoes. They are difficult to hit due to their small size and high speed. The sound of the Packard engines was no longer just an annoyance. It was a harbinger of chaos. The Japanese Navy began a frantic effort to counter the threat. They started mounting more small-caliber, rapid-fire automatic cannons on their destroyers. They changed their tactics, approaching the islands with even greater caution, their lookouts straining to catch a glimpse of the low-profile wooden hulls. The PT boats were forcing the powerful Imperial Navy to change its behavior. The most famous incident of this chaotic, close-quarters war occurred on the night of August 2nd, 1943. A young lieutenant junior grade named John F. Kennedy was in command of PT-109 on patrol in Blackett Strait. The night was moonless and pitch black. Suddenly, out of the darkness, the massive steel bow of the destroyer Amagiri loomed over them. The Japanese ship, traveling at high speed, had not seen the small, dark boat until it was too late. Commander Hanami, on the bridge of the Amagiri, had no time to open fire. He simply plowed directly over the PT boat, cutting the wooden hull in two and igniting its fuel in a massive fireball. For the crew of the Amagiri, it was a moment of brutal, grim satisfaction. They had finally swatted one of the pests. They did not stop. Their mission was too important. They steamed on into the darkness, leaving the survivors of PT-109 clinging to the wreckage. The incident, which would become a legend of American survival, was for the Japanese simply a violent, momentary collision in a war defined by darkness and confusion, highlighting the danger for both sides. As the campaign in the Solomons dragged on, the PT boat war became one of relentless harassment. Night after night, the boats would roar out of their hidden bases at Tulagi or Rendova. They would lay mines in the channels. They would shoot up Japanese supply barges. They would land Marine raiders and coast watchers on isolated beaches. They were a constant bleeding wound on the Japanese war effort, a force that could never be pinned down. They embodied a form of warfare alien to the Japanese military mind, decentralized, improvisational, and relentless. The Japanese built a handful of exquisite warships. The Americans built hundreds of PT boats. Higgins Industries in New Orleans, using assembly line techniques, was churning out a PT boat every 60 hours. It was the same story as the King Tiger versus the Sherman, a story of quality versus quantity. But here, the quantity was crewed by men with a spirit of aggressive independence that made them incredibly effective. The psychological toll on the Japanese sailors was immense. A Japanese diary recovered from a sunken destroyer contained a chilling entry. Every night, the devil boats come. We hear the sound of their engines, but we cannot see them. We fire into the darkness, but we hit nothing. Then the torpedoes come. There is no honor in this kind of fighting. It is not war. It is a haunting. The sound of the Packard engines had become the sound of fear itself, a promise of a sleepless night spent staring into an empty black sea, waiting for an attack that could come from any direction. By the time the Solomons were secured, the legend of the PT boat was firmly established. They had not won the war on their own, but they had played a crucial, often overlooked role. They had helped to sever the logistical lifeline of the Japanese army, contributing to the starvation and eventual collapse of the garrisons on Guadalcanal. They had transformed the Japanese perception of the sea at night from a safe highway into a terrifying gauntlet, and they had done it with a weapon their enemy had initially dismissed as a joke. In the end, the story of the PT boats in the Solomons is a story of how a different philosophy of war triumphed. The Imperial Japanese Navy, with its magnificent steel warships and samurai ethos, was a force built for a single, decisive battle. They were utterly unprepared for a protracted, messy guerrilla war at sea. The PT boat, a cheap, expendable wooden craft powered by a mass-produced American car engine and crewed by citizen sailors, was the perfect weapon for that kind of war. It was a weapon that reflected the society that built it, adaptable, innovative, resilient, and capable of turning its industrial and individualistic spirit into a potent force. The loud, brash, unsynchronized roar of the Packard engines echoing through the dark straits of the Solomon Islands was more than just the sound of an engine. It was the sound of a different kind of power, a power that did not rely on the perfection of a single exquisite blade, but on the relentless, swarming attack of 1,000 determined individuals. It was the sound of a democracy going to war, and for the officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the sound of a nightmare from which they could not awake.